Okay, this video is to walk you through the steps you'll take to do the QRI with your student. And I'm going to talk about specific pages in your book, so you might want to have your book out while you are listening to this, and you can pause the video, you can look at the page, you can make sure that you understand. What I would like you to do is to watch this video before Tuesday's class, February 7th, and then we'll begin class with questions on what you need to do with the QRI. The reason for doing the video here and having you watch it prior to class is I would like to begin to spend more class time on things that you can do with your student. What are some activities that you can be working with in order to help your child to advance in their literacy skills? So let's go through the QRI, and we're going to begin talking about the word list, which begin on page 86 in your book. So you probably have already completed a word list assessment with your students. And it talks about in the book, if you have not done this, that you can start maybe a couple of grade levels below and then you move up. The goal is to have a word list of 20 words that the student has read correctly, 100%. So if you look at the examiner word list, you can start with the primer on page 92. So one thing we didn't talk about in class is that you would just give the student 20 words. You wouldn't give them the 20 words on one side and then the 20 words on the other side. You would cover up one half of that and just give them 20 words. You want to get to a point where the student is getting 100%, and that's where you're going to start your passages. Okay? So prior to giving the QRI to your student, you will then begin looking at the passages and determine from your word list where you think you're going to begin with your student. And you can choose to either do a narrative passage or an expository passage. And I'll talk at the end a little bit more about that. So the first thing you do when you do your passage for your student is you ask the student the concept questions. Now you probably recall that I talked about this in class and that you will learn a lot about some background knowledge that your students have, whether or not they can answer those concept questions correctly. In general, if students are able to answer the concept questions correctly, they will do better on that reading passage. But that doesn't, if they don't do well on the concept questions, that doesn't mean don't do that passage. You can still kind of take a chance and see how that goes. So if you look on pages 27 and 28 in your manual, that talks specifically about how you administer the concept questions and how you score them. What kinds of things you can ask if the student is getting it wrong or just saying, I don't know. You can kind of probe, do you know anything about that? Have you ever heard that word before? Those kinds of things are perfectly okay to do. So after you've done the concept questions, then you do basically what you are doing, and we did talk about this in class, is a running record that is timed. And details on this are on pages 48 and 49 in the manual, so you may want to turn there and just take a look at that. So by doing this timed reading, you can choose to time the whole passage, or you can let your timer go for a minute and just mark on your part of the passage how far the student got in that first minute. You can do that either way. But it shows you how to do the timing, and you will also be marking as we marked in the running record. So you'll mark errors, you'll mark insertions, omissions, and self-corrections. You may want to write down, if you can, what the child said instead of the correct word. And it also does help at this point if you want to audio record that passage so you can go back and look at it. And then finally, the last thing that you're going to be listening for is the fluency, or as it's called in many places, the prosody, the child's ability to read fluently with inflection and with expression. And that marking scale is on page 50. So all of those things you will probably be, if you do audio record, you can look at that later and determine some of those things. Then you want to go into the comprehension part. The first part of the comprehension is retelling. So you're asking the student, tell me everything that you know about this passage. And the student may look at you and say, I just read it to you. Don't you know what it says? Or they may give you that look that indicates that's what they're thinking. So you could say to them, imagine that you're telling this to somebody who did not get to hear it. And what would you say? What do you remember about it? Again, if you can audio record that, then you can listen to it later and you can mark on their papers a little bit later more thoroughly than you can do while they're just sitting there and telling you. But again, there's an example of how to do this marking on pages 54 and 55. In general, if they have less than 50% of the retelling that are listed for that passage, then they're probably having some poor levels of comprehension. This may be something that you decide you'll work on for your action research project. And the other thing to remember is that while you record or mark on the retelling, it does not go into their final score. Okay? So then the next thing that you want to do is to ask questions, the comprehension questions. And again, we talked a little bit about these in class. There's both implicit questions and explicit questions. When you have the child do the retelling, you turn the paper over that they have just read, you ask them to retell, and then you begin to ask the questions. And you go through all the questions, and if the child has missed a question and you think that if they were to look at it, the story, they might be able to answer that question, then once you've gone through all the questions, you turn the paper back over and you say, now let's go back to this question about where the person was, or whatever it is that the question is, and say, can you find in the story where that happened? Okay, so once you've asked the questions, now you've got a running record. You have an idea of their percent of accuracy. And again, we talked about in class, for many purposes, 95% accuracy is independent level, but for the purposes of this QRI, it is 98%. So they can't miss very many words, and they drop down to instructional level. And then if you look on page 52 in your book, you will see criteria for determining reading levels at the bottom there. And so you have the questions. This is how you determine the reading level for their comprehension, and what number of questions they have to get right for each different level of passage in order to be on the instructional or independent instructional or frustration. So your goal is to find an instructional level for the student. Now, you can do a couple of different levels in the same day, especially if you see one of two ends where they're not getting any or very few of the comprehension questions correct, then you know you need to drop down. Or if they're getting them all correct, you know you need to go up. Now, if they're somewhere in the middle and you don't want to take the time to really figure out, are they instructional, are they independent, where are they? You can take that home, you can look at it, look at the book, figure out where the child is, and then you can move on the next week and either go up or down depending on where. But your goal in this class is to find the instructional level, and that's where you're going to work with your child. Okay? So the other thing that you want to make a note of is if they do well on the explicit questions but not on the implicit questions, that could lead to an action research project for you. So all of the things that you've been doing up to this point could become the focus of your action research project. So you could do information that you get from the QRI, where they are instructionally, how they do retelling, how they do with different types of questions, or how they do on either narrative or expository. So you may find that they do pretty well, or they're close to grade level on narrative, but they are not reading on grade level at expository, or not even close to grade level. So that may be an area that you want to work. You want to work explicitly with your action research on improving this child's ability to read expository text. You may find information in the spelling inventory that you think, this is where I'm going to work on my action research. This is what my question is going to be. Or you may find information on your writing sample. Okay. So I'm looking at my notes to make sure that I have talked about everything that I want to talk about. One final place that you can look in the book that will prove to be helpful to you, I believe, is page 85. And page 85 gives a complete list of all of the topics and the passages. And you may want to look at this after you've done your word list, and look at that and determine where it is that you want to start. Okay, from here, what I would like you to do is to bring any questions after you've looked at all of these pieces, and maybe you've even started the QRI, but you're not quite sure where you're going to go next. Bring any questions to class on Tuesday, February 7th, and we'll begin there. But then in class, what I want to do is move on to what are we going to do with our students. So be sure you've read the other book. It's actually the one that has Caldwell's name first. So Caldwell and Leslie, Intervention Strategies. You will have read chapters 3 and I believe chapters 6 and 7. I'll make sure that I post that on Moodle. Okay, good luck, have fun, and I will see you Tuesday. Bye-bye.